Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Campus Consortium's EdTalks, featuring Clemson University. Today's topic for the EdTalks is Identity Management and Trust Services, improving security, managing identities, and end-user accessibility. Our presenters include Ms. Jill Gemmill, who is the Chief Technology Officer, Middleware at Clemson University, and Mr. Vincent Lamba, Vice President, Community Engagement at Campus Consortium. We will take questions at the end of today's presentation that have been typed into the chat box or questions pane in your GoToWebinar control panel. Without further ado, please allow me to present Mr. Lamba and Ms. Gemmill. Over to you, Ms. Gemmill.
All right, so I'm here to talk today about identity management, trust and identity, and my goal is to hopefully help you think about how you're thinking about your identity management in the context in which you're making decisions. I'm going to cover the following topics as I go through. First, I'm going to tell you what I think identity management is and is not. I'm going to describe an identity management maturity model. I'm going to talk about current functional requirements with an emphasis on collaboration. I'll say a little bit about authorization, access control, provisioning. I'll tell you about a next generation identity and access management system that we are developing at Clemson, and then we'll go into Q&A. So first of all, what is identity management? From IT's perspective, we want to know who's accessing the systems and data that we manage. We may want to have a trustworthy level of assurance about the strength of their identity. And that's typically, this is using the US government's description of levels of assurance. Level 1 is you have a working email address, and a lot of public work with the government as well as social media work with this level of user identity. Level 2, which is typically the identities we manage in our university, are vetted with a person laying eyeballs on social security number, and government ID, and that sort of thing. Level 3 is a stronger authentication mechanism, such as dual authentication, and level 4 would be very higher levels of security than that. Also for IT, it's having a unique identifier so that we can we have a knowledge of who specifically is the person that we're dealing with. The end user has a very different perspective on identity management. For them, it's their name on the internet. They usually have more than one name on the internet, and they don't like having, I say greater than N, and N is usually 7, like a number you can remember. So some people like having lots of different names on the internet. They may just separate their public and private personas that way, or for other reasons, but they don't like having thousands of identities, like one per service. That is not a good model for end users. So what identity management is not limiting one single identifier per user. An identity. It should not generally be used to authorize access to anything except for the most broad basic services that are open to everyone in your identity store but no one else. For example, access to journals at your library. But we should be using higher levels of information than just the username to give people access to things, and I'll talk about more about that later. I also want to stress the point that identity is not managed without policy. You're probably all familiar with this, but IT should not be who decides the contents of the official data store. We don't add or remove people. We don't make decisions about who may access what. Nor does should IT decide what data from the identity store can be released. All of those All of these decisions need to be handled under an institutional data security policy with assignment of responsibilities for those decisions. And what IT is responsible for is implementing and honoring those policies, not inventing them. Here are my thoughts on what a maturity model for identity looks like. Do you have one central identity store fed by systems of record? For instance, Registrar Human Resources. Can you identify and eliminate duplicates? So that's the sort of core of a central identity store. Secondly, is there an institutional data policy? Many universities have been working on this over the past years, but some institutions, including my own, are a little bit behind on the ball because they have had, because of the institutional culture here. Now, you may have one identity store, but do you have a single sign-on? Is anyone using your central identity store? And that is, are all the services and systems on campus using the central identity store for authentication into that different application? If not, then you've got multiple identity stores around, the one that IT manages and other ones, and that is not a good situation. A little more advanced, are you a member of InCommon and do you run Shibboleth, which is the Internet 2 SAML single sign-on solution for federated identity? If you do that, then you're ready to make use of some. One of the great things that's grown out of this program is, in addition to cross-campus access, but probably one of the main uses has been telling vendors Internet 2 SAML is the way that we want to interface our identity store with your Box, Dropbox, Amazon Web, Adobe, whatever cloud service. So that's a solution that can be reused at other campuses. I think I covered, do all the systems on campus use single sign-on? And then do you provide dual authentication? Now, single sign-on is good for security. You haven't duplicated your data. One thing that happens when you have duplication is that you have synchronization problems and things are out of date. But probably more importantly, you don't need to worry about the authentication security on the system, these identities in it that are being managed by someone else. And if you have reasons to lock people out, or either very suddenly because they've been behaving badly and you need to remove their access, or just as a matter of course, they've left the institution, they've graduated after some period of time, or they've left employment, you have one place that you can remove access to the university systems that they had when they were in the university. For the same reason, single sign-on can be very annoying to end users because of being a single point for locking people out. What if you've left the university but in July, and then come February the following year you want to get to your online tax statement? Whoops. What if you graduated and you, as a PhD student, and you get hired in a tenure track job at another university, or as a postdoctoral researcher at a different institution? But it's quite typical for a PhD student to continue collaborating with their advisor for 5 to 7 years after they leave, using data that was worked on during the student's dissertation. Well, they may need to access that data. So those are use cases where the single sign-on and just automatically applying access policies can become problematic. Another thing I'd like to talk about a lot is, what do you do with all the other people you have in your identity store? Starting with the case of the postdoc or a graduated PhD student who needs to get back into things, we typically have these things we call guest or affiliate identities, and they're all the people in our identity store that are neither students nor employees, or alumni or whatever official, they don't come from systems of record, they come from somewhere else. Or even if we have forced them, I was in an institution that forced these people to go through systems of records. There was a process where HR would add them, but how are you actually keeping track of this type of affiliation compared to the employee student rights type of affiliation? And at a deeper level, I'd like to ask, why do we even have these guest and affiliate accounts? My thinking on this is that in our mind, we have been designing identity stores as if we were designing for a closed universe. We have identities that we own the resources. We can use the identities we own to provide access to the resources we own, and a lot of times that's because we're actually using successful authentication and a username to authorize things. And this model is as out of date as thinking that you can put a firewall around your whole institution and guard everything inside because, there should be no external access. It just, I'd be thinking in that way is as out of date as that. I think instead we should be modeling and designing for open and multi-direct collaboration, where we think of ourselves as components in our identity stores as components of a global system of collaboration. This is certainly how our faculty think about it and the work that they do. And if you talk to faculty and their use cases, you'll see that this is actually first and foremost on their thinking. The world of collaboration today is global, it's international, it includes people and services who are not able technically to use SAML authentication. It does include people who have social identities. Yes, they're at a lower level of assurance, but they are useful. It includes people from outside of your campus. All these as services that we are in a period where the services that are offered to our communities, campus communities, are no longer necessarily services that we manage and operate. They may be out in the cloud. And what we do is we have some sort of a contract about how our institution can use those services. And then what the identity group does is interface our authentication services with those external services, most of the time sharing the username or a unique identifier to map the name known on campus to the name known on these remote services. But it's not just file sharing. There are remote data sets that researchers access. There are remote compute resources, and even remote instruments, not just the beamline at CERN, but lots of other facilities at Argonne National Labs, astronomical instruments that are located all over the world, that you no longer have to actually travel to the place to go use the instrument. And so from the faculty member and the students that are working with them's perspective, collaboration is an essential service. And I think it's one that IT organizations and identity management groups within IT organizations should be focusing on. What collaborators want is an environment where they can manage, they want to self-manage their own group memberships and make it easy for the group, their collaborative group, to access resources. So easy, not leaping over lots of hurdles. And yes, there need to be policy and out-of-band agreements about why this group gets to use that service and so on, but still technically it's becoming very typical way that people work together in collaboration groups that cross institutional boundaries. But the technology that we're building as campus identity managers is not necessarily helping them to work in that way. So I think a lot of identity management people I've talked to have never actually talked with faculty members or listened to research requirements use cases. And I think it's useful for that kind of dialogue and conversation to occur. I think that understanding needs to be included in your identity management design and architecture processes. And also, if you are a member of InCommon and the Shibboleth Consortium, it's important to help faculty members that you become part of the InCommon Research and Scholarship Profile that releases name and email address to these remote services providers, such as, the Exceed supercomputing resources, because people from your campus have gotten permission to use a supercomputer funded by the National Science Foundation somewhere. There are campuses, perhaps yours is one of them, that don't want to release this information to remote research service providers, such as the ones that I mentioned, although they have no problem at all releasing this very same information, name and email address, to Box or Adobe or Dropbox, etc. So if that's the case, why? Why is it okay for a commercial vendor to have this information, but you think there's some security problem in providing that same service to research service entities? So now on to the topics of authorization and access control. At universities, we typically do this by group assignments. Some may be doing role-based access control, but typically group membership is how we further manage access to resources. So we have students, employees, that fuzzy affiliate guest group. We have membership in departments, although that's never easy to populate, is it? Because what the university systems of record say is different than joint appointments and other things that people have that don't necessarily show up there. Do you have a system that allows members of your institution to set up their own groups? I call those self-serve groups. And ask yourself this: do your self-serve groups allow inclusion of identities that are not in your central store? So if a faculty member wants to set up a group for himself and students so that they can share some files, no problem. But what if the faculty member has an external collaborator at a different institution, and that collaborator's students, and they're working together on something? Do you have a group management system that will allow that to happen? Or are you thinking only about your campus IDs when you're not designing for collaboration if you don't do that? At the end of this talk, I have a list of links that take you to a lot of the tools that I'm going to be mentioning as I go along. But here there is an open source group management tool called Grouper. We don't use it at Clemson, but it's in use at many other places. It's open source, and it's part of the Internet 2 open source for identity management offerings. There's also an open source identity store and collaboration tool called CoManage that has software you can get or is a service you can purchase through CI Logon, and the prices there are very reasonable. There are relationships between your identity store and the groups. If you have a group management system, can you add and delete group memberships automatically based on changes to the identity store? So if a new person comes in, are they automatically added to groups such as department, whatever, part of a college? Automatically, if they change departments, does their affiliation change automatically? And if you changed harder policy, if you change your policy, it used to be all students could access our local high-performance computing cluster, but then we decided to restrict undergraduate access unless they went through a different process. So they're no longer automatically entitled. Can you implement a policy change like that in an automated way? Final piece of overall identity and access management system is accounts, provisioning accounts. So to me, this provisioning process connects an identity or a unique name from your identity store to a specific set of system resources. For example, some disk space, a specific kind of disk space, which we call your mailbox. Another kind of specific disk space that we call your home account in Unix or your desktop environment in Windows. It may even have to do with what network you're permitted to get to. With other things are video conferencing services, online courses, all these things. Basically, there's some space, some rights, some other things inside of these services that need to be allocated per unique name, and those are what the provisioning is. So, can you provision these resources automatically from your identity and group stores? Do you know which of these are provisioned for this special affiliate guest category? When people or groups leave, do you ever deprovision these resources? I'll tell you honestly, at Clemson, we haven't ever figured out how to do that. We've had several plans, even faculty-approved ones that never go anywhere. It's hard. Are you sure that your access control implementation exactly follows university policy? Are you able to actually validate what your access control policy is? For example, given an identity, can you identify all the resources and services that that identity is able to access? And conversely, if given a particular service, can you identify the identities that are able to access to it? And where do your guest and affiliate identities fit inside of this validation and monitoring scope? Access control is implementation of your policy. Policies are your business rules. How many of your policy and business rules are hidden in lines of code where it's not easy to even extract what they are? Some of you may remember back in the year 2000, and all the original university systems were written in COBOL, and there was great problems moving out of COBOL into other more modern service environments. But one of the biggest reasons was not technology, it was that the business rules of the university were all buried in the code inside of these programs, and the people who wrote them had evolved or left, and where people had evolved, they may be familiar with some parts, but other parts of the system, they always just worked like that, whatever like that was. And in some cases, no one had any idea what the business rules were. It was hard, you know, if you were going to rewrite the system, how would you be sure that you reproduced all of those business rules that were hidden? Given these questions, I have some ideas about what a next generation identity and access management system might look like. It will definitely provide collaboration as a service. It will integrate, it'll think of itself as a federated service, whether that's federated with other universities using Shibboleth and SAML, or whether it is federated with social identities. We have to stop thinking of people as an identity we create and manage inside, and think of their identity as something that may belong to the user that they bring with them. In fact, even students where we may give them a university identity, they have social identities that they may prefer to get communications from the university about, you know, your bill is overdue or whatever, at those addresses. So we need a way to integrate the identities we have with social identities, at least to know that this is the same person. We need to have the policy and rules extracted from the code and stored elsewhere. We used to bury people's names in an account that was buried inside of the software, and the great triumph of identity management systems is that all that authentication information, and if you have single sign-on, even the authentication process itself, all of that was extracted out of the code, so you didn't have to worry about how this particular piece of code does that particular function. You have one place where it's being done and monitored, and you have it's as strong as you can design it to be. So we need to go in that same direction with, I have a friend, Mike, who calls those the if-ins in the code. If then, if then, if then. All that needs to come out of the code. And we need to base access control on attributes that include more than just group membership. So we not only think this at Clemson, we've been working on writing such a system that we call the adaptive framework. Our framework, it's been in development for maybe 4 years. It's currently in alpha, and we are in discussions with our research foundation about an open source release, because other people using it means there'll be other people to help improve and maintain it, which is the beauty of the open source system. Now, the way that we've done our identity management, and we call our central store the vault, so it's our Clemson University vault. The first task is that data from these systems of record is in all sorts of different formats, and that somehow you have to take that format and turn it into a format you can use, or into a format that's usable to another system that has a particular formatting requirement. And we had been doing that by modeling these transformations in a Google spreadsheet, and then we would translate the spreadsheet to XML, and then we would translate from XML to LDAP, and the design in that and changes were all done by hand. This has worked, but there are two things. One, there's some hand work by human hands in there, which is subject to a higher level of error than, not that machines are perfect, but they have a lower, or at least they're consistent about the errors they make, so you can find them. And secondly, you've taken your original data stores and replicated them at least once, perhaps twice, to shovel them around in the way that the service that you're writing to wants it to look like. What would be better than that is something that's adaptive. As applications become more sophisticated, they need to leverage data from multiple sources. And it's hard for humans to understand the sources, the meaning of the sources, the formatting, and how the policy applies to those, how university policy applies to the specific data sources that they're looking at. Plus, even if you figure all this out once, rules will change over time. So if you pull the access control out of the code, you'll know where to go to change access control rules when your policy changes. And the other advantage of abstracting away from underlying data stores is that you avoid vendor lock-in. If you have a representation of data and its meaning not solely inside of an application, then you can at will change vendors and redesign a mapping from your standard design into the new system. So that's what we think of as being an adaptable system. What is an adaptive object? Well, anything you can do. The term adaptive object model was developed independently at Clemson by a guy named Mike Gossett, who's been a primary architect of this, and he also He's been around long enough that he was the primary architect for a product that's now known as NetIQ, which Clemson has sold to external service as a product. But I'm saying this to say that this is actually a team of people with deep identity management systems understanding and a history of having written long-lasting commercial code. It's good stuff, folks. Looking around for things called adaptive objects, we discovered that there was a guy named Yoder and some others who had a similar concept in the same name. So our implementation's a little different than what's described in those works, but it's a thought that's floating out there. And the key concepts are classes, attributes, relationships, and behavior in an adaptive object model. All those representations are in metadata. The model is based on instances, not classes, and that makes the object adaptive because when the XML, JSON, whatever descriptive information of the object changes, the system immediately reflects those changes without having to recompile classes and such. It's objects all the way down. I don't have time to tell you about the entire system. I'll just say there's every object has an object type. The type is described in metadata. Properties have adaptive values, which are listed here, including C. It can be a function call, a lambda function, a list, etc. There are property types. The authorization system is designed on the policy decision point XACML model. In fact, there is the open source has a completely compliant XACML model in it, except we don't think anyone can actually write XACML rules too complicated. So for our use, but the point is you can plug in your own rule system to use. But this function check authentication, when you check authentication, because of the way that the system has been designed, you know whether the subject is the subject directly or a process or secondary person acting on behalf of the subject, what method they've been using to authenticate. So now it's hard. Now we go by service, like, you know, service A you can get into with your campus authentication, but service B, you have to use dual authentication. So we separate the authentication methods by saying you need it for this service, but not that service. With the adaptive method, the way that you authenticated is included in metadata so that you know what level of assurance, what, you know, is this a certificate? Is this a social identity? You know what resource is asking to be accessed. You know what the action access request is. And there's environment information, which may be time of day, location. All those things can be taken into account to check authorization. There is an overall system design. I won't even try to cover that now. You know, if you're interested, we'll come back after we've gotten our open source process through our research foundation and talk to you about it if you're interested in probably 6 months. But imagine, just except for now, there is such a system. So features are the access control rules are not in the code. When you change a rule in one place, since the system always references that rule before implementing it, the entire system gets updated. There are mappings that can reformat any native data store into any other data representation. So it goes from native store to an adaptive format, and then from adaptive format back to any other store. So you can design the mapping once and it works. It eliminates the need to build aggregating stores, although for some performance reasons you might decide that you want to. Also gives you, you have the ability to look across systems because you have these mappers that know how to pull data out of each one, having first verified that the request is a valid one. There's a journaling of all events and requests, which provides improved security and an audit trail. And there's per action authorization. So things aren't logged unless they're already authorized. So there's a separate log for failed access attempts. So if something fails, you have one place to look. But because the policy decision point is ahead of the actual, do this, when you see something in the log, it's happened. So it gives you much more granular security. And that is what I wanted to cover today. The resources, the In Common Federation, Shibboleth, Single Sign-On, the Internet 2, Trust and Identity, and Education and Research, the In Common Research and Scholarship category, Grouper, Co-Manage, and FeduShare, which is a project federated non-web access across campuses. So with that, I'll take your questions. I hope I can provide some answers, and I think our hosts are going to take over control and give me the questions.
Hey, thank you, Jill. And before we take questions, and there are quite a few coming in, I would just like to take a minute to introduce you. I know we missed that because I don't know if you noticed there was a silence in the beginning for about 5 minutes, and then we realized that the network was down. So for everybody who's dialed in, we want to just quickly complete Jill's introduction as well. And Jill, thank you so much for doing such a wonderful presentation. Jill is a creator, and creative innovator who is persistently addressed the gap between university IT services and the IT requirements for university research. So those of you who are not familiar, she has bootstrapped multiple programs to address those gaps via external funds. Jill has over 35 years of experience in university information technology, and her collaborative and effective leadership has been recognized by awards including Data Center Executive of the Year Award in 2008 for campus IT infrastructure reengineering. She's also won the ESRI Special Achievement Award in 2003. So that's a little bit about Jill. Jill, once again, thank you so much for presenting for us here today. There are a few questions that have come in, so let me take them one by one. Charles Bartlett from Charles is asking a couple of questions, so let's take those up. He's saying, are there any suggestions for the medical industry EMRS or EMRs? Did you get that, Jill?
Yeah, does he mean emergency management services or?
I think so. Let me quickly check. Charles, if you can hear us and hear, Jill's counter, please reply on the. He's saying electronic medical records.
Records. Oh. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a whole other can of worms, although the principles apply. But I think you'll find, let's take the Veterans Administration. They have shared medical records because they all fall under the, government and single administration. So you can walk into a VA clinic anywhere in the country. They have electronic medical records. They can access your records. But we have a private hospital in Greenville, South Carolina, which is nearby. They have some cardiology research going on, and they're collaborating with engineers at Clemson. They don't actually give faculty access to the patient's personally identifiable information, but they may with IRB approval, extract data which can be accessed by Clemson engineering faculty, not personally identifiable, but certainly not public, right? So that's the same kind of collaboration in instance between a university and a hospital where there is a reason to share. Now, I haven't worked at I used to work at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, which has a university hospital. But typically university hospitals have their own IT group, which is a little different from the campus IT, but still the university hospital may have patients coming in from regional hospital clinics, and those medical records might be shared, or they may have a desire to share. And it's something that the IT staff of the university hospital might have to deal with. So I think I've rambled on enough about this, but I think the same requirements exist in a little different format, and I think the same principles that I've talked about apply.
Right. Thank you. I just want to make sure that Charles, if if you heard that, let us know if if that answers your question, or if you have any follow-up question on that. And Charles also asked if if the deck or the recording will be sent out to all. The answer to that is yes, and we will be following up after this session, and as a part of the recap, we will be sending out the recording and the presentation to everybody who's attended the seminar today. There are a couple of more questions coming in for you, Jill. There's a question from Michael, and he's asking, a lot of institutions have different usernames and passwords for different applications. Most contemporary single sign-ons and need a single source of authentication. Can you advise on how an institution can consolidate an identity store? Should everything be in AD?
Did you say AD?
AD, right?
AD is one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, AD is one central store. Other people use one or another LDAP server. We consider our vault, the data store is, we may replicate. We think of our vault as being something locked up because it has lots of personally identifiable information in it.
Right.
So we populate from our vault into a directory of some kind, because a lot of applications use LDAP or Windows app authentication but how you get there. So that's right. That's maturity model 1.
Right.
You get these days, I think you get there through a security track. You talk about cybersecurity, you talk about, and when I say you, it's got to be the chief information officer, and it has to be something the chief information officer talks about with the owners of those systems of record, the registrar, the human resources department, and if you have all these guest and affiliate things, you need to figure out where those are coming in from. Anyway, you need to capture the space of identities that are floating around in your university. And you have to convince those people.
Oh, okay, I wasn't sure if I caught that. So, but everything that...
Sorry about that.
I'm sorry, things dropped off.
Yeah, no, that's, yeah, sorry about that.
Anyway, that's, yeah, you need some central impetus to get this together, but it's the owners of the systems of records, the chief information officer, if there's a chief security officer, and that's not part of IT. Those three interests need to get together and say, for the security of the university, to help minimize breaking into our systems being hacked, to make sure we have a handle on who's accessing resources at the university, where there may be personally identifiable or student information. We need to go in this direction, and then you have that group work together on how to feed a central store. They have to trust that you're not going to They have to understand from the beginning you're not going to give any of the data that's in that store to anybody else without their authorization. So there's a certain level of trust among these parties needed, and then you need once the desire is there, you need an implementation team to make it happen within whatever infrastructure you use. And then after you have that, you go around one by one to the different applications that are doing something else, do the security wrap, and why do you can still manage your application. We're just taking the authentication piece out. You don't need to handle password resets. We'll do that for you. You need to get the applications on board, which may be a one-by-one process.
Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Mike. Jill, that was extremely extensive, and thank you. There's a couple of more questions coming in. Mike Sheriff from South Louisiana Community College is asking, what do you need to implement SSO beside AD, Active Directory, that is? Did you catch that, Jill?
Single sign-on? Well, to do it the shibboleth way, which I recommend, and shibboleth handles web access only. Although it has a non-web piece, but that's less developed. But most applications you access today with a web browser, so it'll cover most cases. The trust and the tier, Internet to tier process holds training sessions. They've sort of got some for doctor campuses for the new tier. These software products have recently, through Internet 2 and investment by larger universities, have become available as virtual machines. Their packaging is much better if you want to install them on your own machines. So you need a shibboleth server. There's lots of documentation on you interface that authentication system, and there are instructions for how to do that with Active Directory. And there are also instructions on how it requires a module for Apache or whatever. There's a Windows equivalent service on each web service that will support the single sign-on, and once you learn how to do it, it's the same for each system. So I'd recommend that you go look at the Shibboleth website, and also look at Internet 2 Tier, TIER, for training and how to get this set up.
Thank you. Mike, if you're listening, okay, he's replied saying thank you. That answers his question. Thank you, Jill. There's one more question that's just come up. This is from Josh Bruick, and he's asking, his question is more around the user attributes and scripts, and and again, I think first and foremost, there's a comparison between Microsoft FIM and MIM, and I'll come to that. But what identity management system are you using, Jill?
Currently, we use Novell EDIR as our primary LDAP directory. But you may remember the slide where I was talking about scripts that rewrite stuff. We actually do have scripts we wrote that convert stuff from our system of record, PeopleSoft in one case, and maybe Oracle free. Anyway, we have two different, the human resource systems, not the same as the registrar system. So they have different data formats, and we convert those using these scripts that I described, and we put them away in a vault, which is a database. But then we populate an LDAP server with that, so that that's what our systems interface with.
All right, I think that covers that. So I think we've come close to the end of the session, and there are no more questions. We can still entertain questions as they're coming in. So as and when they come in, I'll be happy to bring them to you, Jill. I would like to thank you, Jill, for presenting for us here today, and it's an honor for us to have you here. I would also like to thank our audience for joining us. Campus Consortium has been dedicated to, host these kind of Ed Talks to bring contribution to the higher education community. Our next Ed Talks will feature Stanford University. We will have Paul Robles. He's the Chief Information Officer at Stanford University, who will share his expertise on top CIO priorities for 2018. The iSeminar is scheduled for April 5th from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern. So, for everyone here today, please block your calendar, and we will reach out to you, of course, accordingly. Just before we call this a wrap, I would like to go over, my last few slides about Campus Consortium, and before we sign off, I would just like to, cover the grant and what are some of the grant programs that we are running. So for everyone who has joined us today, I would like to let you know that that Campus Consortium has been running a lot of initiatives and programs to help higher ed, and one of them are, of course, our grant programs. We have already awarded more than 10.1 million, grants since January last year, including attendance tracking, campus safety, and campus portal. As you can see on your screen, these are the special grants, as part of this webinar today that we are running, single sign-on and identity grant. The deadline for this, of course, is 16th March, or March 16th, should I say. We have whole bunch of awardees, and you will be seeing on our social media sites from time to time. We want to make sure that we're doing well for all of you. We want to help as many people as we can. So moving forward, for these grants, what we cover is implementation and licensing cost. In few categories, of course, for others we provide some discounts. For single sign-on and identity, the grant reward is $91,500. It covers 100 active user licenses and implementation cost for 3 single sign-on applications, a cumulative period of about 5 years. The total number of grants available is 5. This is also open to public sector organizations, K-12 institutions as well. What we need in order to give you these grants to your institutions is just to know that that you demonstrate commitment that really requires a solution on campus, and we are willing to help you out. If you want to apply, you can visit our website at campusconsortium.org, or simply submit your grant application at grantapplication@campusconsortium.org. You will receive this deck in the form of the email, like I mentioned earlier, after the session is concluded. If you have any questions or you want to connect with Jill, you can simply send us an email at info@campusconsortium.org. We are on top of the hour. I would like to now bring the session to an end. Once again, thank you to our beautiful audience who've been, very patient. And again, thank you so much, Jill, for being such a, wonderful host for us today. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. This is Vincent on behalf of Campus Consortium signing off.